In the oldest text that human hands ever wrote, there is a place. Not a myth exactly. Not a legend invented to explain what cannot be understood. Something older than myth. Something that appears in the very first moments of written human memory. Before Homer, before the Bible, before any story that Western civilization has traditionally called foundational. The Sumerians wrote of it on clay tablets 5,000 years ago. They called it the land where death does not exist, the land where the lion does not kill, the land where the wolf does not seize the lamb, the land where the sick man does not say, "I am sick," the land where the old woman does not say, "I am old." They called it Dilmun. This was not a story about heaven. The Sumerians were not a people given to vague spiritual consolations. They were the inventors of writing, of the city, of organized law and commerce. They were, in the most precise sense, the people who created civilization as we understand it. And what they wrote about Dilmun was not poetry detached from reality, it was geography. Dilmun was real, its cities were real, its harbors were real, its merchants walked the docks of Sumerian cities, carrying their goods and their ledgers, conducting the trade that connected the Persian Gulf to the great civilizations of the ancient world. It sat in the waters of the Gulf on an island of freshwater springs and date palms and pearl beds, controlling the sea routes that linked Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, the routes along which the wealth of the ancient world moved. And it was extraordinary enough that the people who traded with it, who knew it through commerce and diplomacy, felt compelled to describe it as paradise, as the garden where the gods walked, as the place before sorrow. This is the Kingdom of Dilmun, and it begins, as all things in the ancient Gulf begin, with water in the desert. To understand Dilmun, you must stand at the edge of the Persian Gulf and look out at the water. The Gulf today is one of the most commercially significant bodies of water on Earth. The waterway through which a significant fraction of the world's oil moves, bordered by some of the wealthiest states in the modern world, crowded with tankers and freighters and the infrastructure of a global petrochemical economy. But strip all of that away, go back 5,000 years, go back to the 3rd millennium BCE, when none of those things existed, when the Gulf was simply the Gulf, a shallow, warm, intensely saline body of water stretching roughly 1,000 kilometers from the Strait of Hormuz in the southeast to the river delta, where the Tigris and Euphrates emptied into it in the northwest. At the western edge of the Gulf, approximately midway along its length, there is an island, or rather, there is an archipelago, a cluster of islands, the largest of them roughly 55 kilometers long and between 15 and 25 kilometers wide, rising gently from the Gulf floor to a low central ridge, its highest point barely 135 meters above sea level. This is modern Bahrain. In the ancient world, it was the heart of Dilmun. The island does not look at first sight like a place of paradise. The terrain is low and flat. The soil is largely sandy and calcareous. The summer heat is brutal. Temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. Humidity that makes the air feel like a wet cloth pressed against the face. But beneath the surface of this apparently inhospitable island, something extraordinary happens. Water, fresh water rising through the limestone bedrock of the island from aquifers that extend beneath the Gulf floor from the Arabian mainland. Submarine springs that well up from the seabed around the island's coasts. Freshwater springs that emerge directly on the beaches, creating pools of clear, cool water at the edge of the salt sea. The ancient Greeks described this phenomenon with wonder. The Arab geographers of the medieval period described it. Modern visitors can still in places see it, the shimmer of fresh water rising through the salt. To any ancient people navigating the Persian Gulf, this was miraculous. In a region defined by the absence of fresh water, by the desert that stretches in every direction, by the salt of the sea, by the fierce competition for every source of drinking water. Here was an island where fresh water simply emerged, where it rose from the earth unbidden in quantities sufficient to sustain agriculture, to water herds, to supply ships. The Sumerians, encountering this phenomenon, found in it the confirmation of something they already believed, that beneath the earth lay the Abzu, the great freshwater ocean that was the foundation of the world, the domain of the god Enki, the source of all wisdom and all fertility. Dilmun, where fresh water rose from the sea floor, was the place where the Abzu touched the surface of the earth. It was, quite literally, the place where the divine freshness of the world broke through. But paradise requires more than fresh water. It requires a position in the world. And the position of Dilmun, of the island that would become the heart of this trading civilization, was, by any measure, extraordinary. Look at the geography of the ancient world in the 3rd millennium BCE. To the northwest, the great cities of Sumer, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, the oldest cities on earth, built in the river delta where the Tigris and Euphrates met the Gulf. These cities needed metals that Mesopotamia could not produce. They needed copper for the tools and weapons of a civilization. They needed timber for buildings in a land without trees. They needed the luxury goods, the lapis lazuli, the carnelian, the ivory that their elites demanded. To the southeast, across the Gulf and beyond the Strait of Hormuz, lay the port of Makkan, ancient Oman, where copper existed in the hills in quantities that Mesopotamia needed desperately. And further still to the east, across the Arabian Sea, lay the Indus Valley, the civilization of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, a great urban culture producing goods that the Mesopotamian world wanted: cotton textiles, carnelian beads, ivory combs, exotic animals. Dilmun sat between all of these, not accidentally, not by chance. The island was at the precise geographic node where the Gulf trade routes converged, where ships from Mesopotamia met ships from Oman, where the goods of the Indus Valley arrived after their long sea voyage around the Arabian Peninsula. To control Dilmun was to control the arteries of ancient world trade. The people who settled Dilmun understood this, and what they built over 2,000 years was a civilization whose power rested not on military conquest, not on agricultural surplus alone, but on the mastery of a position, on the intelligence to understand what their location meant, and the organizational capacity to exploit it. The history of Dilmun is not a history recovered from written records alone. The Dilmunites, unlike the Sumerians and the Egyptians, did not produce a substantial indigenous written literature. What they left behind is primarily material, the physical residue of their cities, their graves, their temples, their trade goods, and the references that appear in the texts of the civilizations they dealt with. This means that the history of Dilmun is, in large part, a history told by archaeologists. And what the archaeologists have found in Bahrain is remarkable. The site of Qal'at al-Bahrain, the great tell on the northern coast of the main island, today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has been occupied more or less continuously for more than 4,000 years. The earliest occupation levels date to approximately 2300 BCE, placing the initial settlement of this site roughly contemporary with the third dynasty of in Mesopotamia, the period when Sumerian civilization was at the height of its power and its commercial reach. The tell itself, the mound of accumulated human occupation that rises above the surrounding plain, is a stratigraphic archive of extraordinary depth. Layer upon layer of construction, destruction, reconstruction, and modification, each layer representing a period of human activity at this location. The lowest levels contain pottery and objects that connect directly to the Mesopotamian world, the material signature of a settlement that was, from its beginning, oriented toward Gulf trade and Mesopotamian commercial contact. As the layers rise, the picture becomes more complex. The Dilmunite culture developed its own distinctive material character, its own pottery styles, its own architectural forms, its own artistic traditions, while remaining in continuous commercial contact with the broader world. The city that grew at Qal'at al-Bahrain was not a modest trading post. It was, at its height, a substantial urban center, with monumental public buildings, a palace complex, temples, residential quarters, and harbor facilities that supported the maritime activity on which the entire system depended. The city wall at Qal'at al-Bahrain is one of the most impressive surviving features of the site. Massive, built from carefully dressed limestone blocks, it enclosed the central city area with a defensive perimeter that speaks of both engineering capacity and the wealth to invest in large-scale public construction. This was not a village, this was a city that knew its own importance and built accordingly. Beyond Qal'at al-Bahrain, the island of Bahrain contains archaeological evidence of Dilmunite civilization on an astonishing scale. The burial mounds. The landscape of Bahrain is dotted with burial mounds, ancient tumuli constructed from earth and stone, marking the graves of the Dilmunite dead. The number of these mounds is extraordinary. Estimates range from 100,000 to 170,000 individual mounds, spread across an island of barely 780 square kilometers. This is one of the highest concentrations of ancient burial sites anywhere in the world. The mounds range from small, simple constructions covering individual graves to large, elaborate monuments. The royal mounds at Ali reach heights of 15 meters and diameters of over 40 meters, requiring substantial organized labor to construct and suggesting burials of considerable social importance. The scale of the burial landscape implies something significant about Dilmun's role in the ancient world. People were being buried here from beyond the island itself. The population of Bahrain at any given moment in the Dilmunite period was probably not large enough to account for 100,000 burials accumulated over a couple of millennia. Dilmun was, archaeologists have suggested, a sacred burial ground, a place where people from the mainland, from the surrounding Gulf region, brought their dead to be interred in the Holy Land, the paradise, the place where the gods had blessed the earth. People came to Dilmun to be close to the divine, even in death. The burial goods recovered from the Dilmunite mounds confirm what the texts suggest. This was a civilization in active commercial contact with the full width of the ancient world: Mesopotamian pottery, Indus Valley objects, the distinctive square stamp seals with their pictographic script, the carnelian beads with their characteristic etched decoration, objects from Oman and the Iranian plateau. Local production of high quality, the Dilmunite stamp seals in particular, are works of considerable artistic refinement, carved in a distinctive local style that combines elements from multiple cultural traditions while remaining unmistakably their own. The material culture of Dilmun is the material culture of a crossroads. Layered, cosmopolitan, eclectic, the product of a civilization that was in contact with many others and absorbed influences from all of them while maintaining its own identity. The most evocative descriptions of Dilmun come not from Dilmun itself, but from Mesopotamia, from the clay tablets of the Sumerian cities that traded with it, that knew it through commerce and through the mythology that commerce inspires. The Sumerians were the first people to write in any sustained way, and what they wrote about Dilmun reveals how extraordinary the place seemed to those who knew of it. The poem known to modern scholars as Enki and Ninhursag, one of the oldest literary texts in the world, dating in its written form to approximately the 3rd millennium BCE, begins with a description of Dilmun that has no parallel in ancient literature. The land of Dilmun is pure, the land of Dilmun is clean, the land of Dilmun is bright. In Dilmun the raven utters no cry, the Itidu bird utters not the cry of the Itidu bird, the lion kills not, the wolf snatches not the lamb, the dog has not learned to make the kid curl up, the pig has not learned to eat grain, the sick-eyed says not I am sick-eyed, the sick-headed says not I am sick-headed, its old woman says not I am old, its old man says not I am old. And this is not a description of a mythological otherworld in the way that later cultures would describe heaven or paradise. The Sumerians knew perfectly well where Dilmun was. Their merchants went there, their ships docked there, their trade records mention it in the most prosaic commercial terms. What they are describing is the quality of the place, the sense at which the island's extraordinary freshwater, springs and its abundance and its apparent freedom from the diseases and conflicts of the mainland must have created, of a place set apart, a place where the ordinary rules of a difficult world did not quite apply. The poem continues to tell how the god Enki, the lord of the freshwater Abzu, the god of wisdom and craft, and the magic that underlies all useful knowledge, brought fresh water to Dilmun at the request of the goddess Ninsikila or Ninhursag, making the land bloom and giving it its sacred character. This myth is not random. It reflects something real, the extraordinary phenomenon of fresh water rising in a place surrounded by salt water in a landscape of desert. The Sumerians encountered this phenomenon and explained it the way they explained all remarkable natural things, as the work of the gods. Enki caused the fresh water to rise. Dilmun was therefore Enki's special place. The connection between Dilmun and Enki runs through multiple Sumerian texts. Enki was the god most associated with the Gulf, with the waters that lay between Mesopotamia and the distant trading partners of the east and south. His city was Eridu, the oldest Sumerian city, at the very edge of the delta where river met sea. The merchants of Eridu and Ur, who sailed down the gulf toward Dilmun were sailing, in the Sumerian religious geography, toward the domain of their patron god. Dilmun was not just a trading partner, it was a sacred destination. And then there is Utnapishtim, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest complete literary work in the world, the story of a great king's search for immortality, places its flood hero in Dilmun. Utnapishtim, the man who survived the Great Flood by building a boat and preserving life on it. A character whose story clearly parallels the later biblical Noah, was granted immortality by the gods and placed to live at the mouth of the rivers in the land of Dilmun. The parallels with the biblical Garden of Eden, a garden of paradise associated with the origins of humanity, located near the meeting of great rivers, a place from which humanity was eventually expelled, have fascinated scholars for generations. The geography is suggestive. The Tigris and Euphrates, two of the four rivers of Eden described in Genesis, flow into the gulf near Dilmun. The imagery of a paradise garden of fresh water rising in a desert place, of a sacred land set apart from the ordinary world. All of this is shared between the Sumerian tradition and the later biblical one. Whether the biblical Eden and the Sumerian Dilmun share a common origin in an even older cultural memory, or whether the resemblances are coincidental, scholars continue to debate. What is not debated is the antiquity and the power of the Dilmun tradition. In the oldest texts of human civilization, this small island in the Persian Gulf already had the weight of paradise. Strip away the mythology for a moment. Stand on the dock at Qal'at al-Bahrain in the year 2000 BCE and look at what is actually happening. Ships, multiple ships of varying sizes, their hulls built from the timber that the Gulf region itself does not produce, imported timber brought from the Indus Valley or from the forests of the Iranian plateau. Their sails catching the seasonal winds that blow up the Gulf from the south in winter and down from the north in summer. Winds that any skilled Gulf sailor could use in both directions, timing the voyages to take advantage of the monsoon pattern. On the docks, merchants, not just Dilmunite merchants, Sumerian merchants from the great cities of the delta, from from Lagash, merchants from the land of Makkan, ancient Oman, carrying ingots of copper from the mines of the Hajar Mountains, merchants from Meluhha, the Indus Valley, carrying cotton textiles, carnelian beads carved with the distinctive etched patterns of the Harappan craftsmen, ivory objects, perhaps even the carved stone seals that appear in Indus Valley contexts across the Gulf. And in the warehouses behind the dock, the goods that Dilmun itself had to offer. Dates, pressed and dried, the agricultural product of the island's abundant date palms. Pearls, harvested from the extraordinary pearl beds of the Gulf floor. The same pearl beds that would make Bahrain famous as the pearl capital of the world right up to the 20th century. Copper, re-exported after arriving from Oman, processed and perhaps alloyed in Dilmunite workshops. The Sumerian commercial texts from clay tablets recording the business transactions of Sumerian merchants in the late 3rd millennium BCE, document the Dilmun trade with the specificity of commercial records. One text, dating to the reign of the Sumerian king Ur-Nammu, records the arrival of a ship from Dilmun carrying copper, the quantity recorded in Sumerian units of weight, the transaction documented with the care that commercial law required. Other texts record the departure of ships for Dilmun, their cargoes of silver and manufactured goods that the Dilmunites received in exchange for what they provided. The quantities are striking. A single text from the period records the arrival of copper from Dilmun in a quantity equivalent to approximately 18 tons. This is not a marginal trade, it is a substantial commercial operation conducted on a scale that required organization, capital, and the administrative apparatus of a sophisticated economy. The Dilmunite stamp seals provide another window into the commercial world. These seals, small, flat-bottomed objects made from stone, typically circular, carved with distinctive designs, were used throughout the ancient Near East to mark ownership and authenticate transactions. Press the seal into soft clay, and the impression it leaves is your signature, your mark, your guarantee. The Dilmunite seals are distinctive enough to be immediately recognizable. Their designs typically feature animals, real and imaginary, arranged in specific ways, often with geometric patterns. The carving style is confident and assured, the product of a craft tradition with its own aesthetic conventions. These seals have been found across an enormous geographic range, in Mesopotamian cities, in Indus Valley sites, in Oman, in the Gulf Islands. They trace the commercial network of Dilmun across the ancient world, turning up wherever Dilmunite merchants went, wherever Dilmunite goods traveled. They are the fingerprints of a trading civilization pressed into the clay of the ancient world. The pearl trade deserves particular attention. The waters of the Gulf around Bahrain contain some of the richest natural pearl beds in the world. The Dilmunites were harvesting these pearls from the earliest periods of their civilization, diving into the Gulf waters, collecting the oysters, extracting the pearls, and trading them northward into Mesopotamia and eastward into the Indus Valley. Pearl diving in the Gulf was physically demanding work. The divers, without any breathing apparatus, holding their breath for as long as their training and physiology allowed, descended to the pearl beds, collected as many oysters as they could carry, and surfaced. In the summer heat, with the Gulf at its warmest and its most saline, this was grueling labor. But the pearls it produced were extraordinary. Natural Gulf pearls, formed over years in the oysters of the warm saline waters, have a luster and quality that made them among the most prized luxury goods of the ancient world. In the palace inventories of Mesopotamian kings, in the personal ornaments of Indus Valley burials, in the luxury goods of Egyptian elites, Gulf pearls appear as the signature luxury of the ancient Near East. The Dilmunites controlled the source. The tell of Qal'at al-Bahrain rises from the flat coastal plain of northern Bahrain like a small hill. Artificial, the product of human occupation accumulated over 4 millennia, its layers compressing the history of a civilization into a stratigraphic column that archaeologists have been reading since the 1950s. The site was first excavated by Danish archaeologists beginning in 1954, the beginning of what would become one of the longest-running and most productive archaeological projects in the Gulf. The Danish expeditions, followed by French and Bahraini teams, have over 7 decades of work produced a picture of this site that, while still incomplete, is one of the most detailed available for any ancient Gulf civilization. The earliest occupation at Qal'at al-Bahrain, the City 1 phase in the archaeologists' periodization, dates to approximately 2300 BCE. The material culture of this period connects the site firmly to the world of the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia. The pottery styles, the trade goods, the architectural forms, all reflect a settlement oriented toward Gulf commerce from its very beginning. As the occupation layers rise through time, City 2, City 3, City 4, City 5, City 6, the picture becomes more complex. Each phase represents a period of development, expansion, and sometimes contraction. The City 2 phase, dating to approximately 2050 to 1800 BCE, represents what many archaeologists consider the height of Dilmunite civilization at Qal'at al-Bahrain. This is the period of the great public buildings, the period when the city's infrastructure was most elaborate and when the material culture is most sophisticated. The temple of Inzak, the patron god of Dilmun, was among the most important structures at the site. While its remains are fragmentary, the evidence of its existence and its central role in the city's religious life is clear from inscriptions and from the spatial organization of the city around the religious precinct. Inzak was a god of considerable power in the Dilmunite world, referenced in Sumerian texts and in the cuneiform inscriptions found at Dilmunite sites. He was a protective deity associated with the specific character and blessing of Dilmun as a sacred place. His temple was not just a place of worship, it was a statement of the city's identity, its claim to divine protection and divine favor. The residential quarters of the ancient city reveal the lives of ordinary Dilmunites with the kind of detail that monumental buildings cannot provide. Houses built from limestone blocks, the local building material available from the island's bedrock in abundance. Multi-room structures with areas that can be identified as cooking spaces, storage areas, and sleeping rooms. Middens, ancient garbage deposits that contain the organic remains of daily life, the bones of the fish that were eaten, the shells of the mollusks that were harvested, the charred seeds of the dates and grains that were consumed. This is the archaeology of a functioning city. Not just the elite spaces, not just the temples and the palaces, but the streets and the houses and the rubbish heaps that tell us what life was actually like for the people who lived there. The harbour infrastructure, the docks, the warehouses, the access roads that connected the port to the city is less well preserved than the buildings further inland, for the obvious reason that harbour areas are subject to the erosion and disturbance of continuous maritime activity. But the evidence of substantial harbour facilities is clear, and the commercial scale of the city's activity is documented in the trade goods found throughout its layers. The Portuguese fort that stands at the top of the Tell today, built in the early 16th century CE, when Portuguese colonial power extended into the Gulf, is historically significant in its own right, but it represents a much later chapter in the site's long history. For the archaeologist interested in Dilmun, the Portuguese fort is both a landmark and an obstacle. The later construction disturbed and in some places destroyed earlier Dilmunite layers. But enough survives, enough to see in the accumulated stone and pottery and ash and bone of 40 centuries of human occupation, the outline of a civilization that was once at the center of the ancient world's commercial life. Stand on the elevated ground in the interior of Bahrain and look across the landscape. In the early morning light, when the shadows are long and the air has not yet taken on the weight of the Gulf heat, the landscape reveals its secret. Mounds everywhere, stretching across the plain in their hundreds, in their thousands. Low, rounded humps of earth and stone that at first might seem like natural features of the landscape, the random hills and ridges of an irregular terrain, But they are not random, they are not natural, they are graves. The burial mounds of Bahrain are one of the most extraordinary funerary landscapes in the ancient world. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Estimates suggest that at the height of Dilmunite civilization, somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 individual burial mounds existed on the island. In an island of less than 800 square kilometers, this represents a density of graves that has no parallel in the ancient world, roughly one burial mound for every 5 or 6 square meters of the island's habitable area. The obvious question, where did all the dead come from? The population of Bahrain at any given moment in the Dilmunite period was probably in the tens of thousands, not large enough to generate this number of graves even over a millennium of occupation. The conclusion that most archaeologists have reached is that Dilmun served as a sacred burial ground for a region far larger than the island itself. People came to Dilmun to bury their dead, from the mainland, from the surrounding Gulf shores, from the other islands of the archipelago. Brought by boat across the Gulf waters, their bodies, or their remains, carried to the Holy Island to be interred in the land that the gods had blessed, the land where fresh water rose from the sea floor, the land where paradise had its address in the world. This practice, burying the dead in a sacred location associated with the divine, is not unique to Dilmun. But the scale of it here is unmatched. The mounds themselves vary enormously in size and elaboration. The smallest are simple constructions, a shallow pit, a body, or cremated remains, a covering of earth raised into a low mound. No goods or minimal goods. The burial is of ordinary people for whom the journey to Dilmun was itself the significant act. The largest are monuments of a different order entirely. The royal mounds at Ali, a cluster of large tumuli in the center of the island, are the most impressive surviving examples of elite Dilmunite burial architecture. The largest of these mounds reaches approximately 15 meters in height and 45 meters in diameter. To construct such a mound, to quarry, transport, and deposit the quantities of stone and earth required, demanded organized labor on a scale that only a sophisticated administrative system could manage. Inside these great mounds, where excavation has been possible, the burial chambers are constructed from carefully dressed limestone blocks, corbelled to support the weight of the mound above. The burial goods placed with the dead reflect the commercial world that Dilmun inhabited: pottery from Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, metalwork, personal ornaments, objects whose origins span the full geographic range of the ancient Gulf trade. The Aali mounds present archaeologists with a particular challenge. They have been known and accessible since antiquity, which means they have also been disturbed and looted since antiquity. Many of the largest mounds were emptied of their most valuable contents long before modern archaeology arrived to record what was there. But smaller, less conspicuous mounds, found in areas away from the main settlement zones, excavated with the careful methods of modern archaeology, have provided detailed information about burial practice and social structure. What they show is a society with real social stratification, differences in grave goods and burial elaboration that reflect differences in status and wealth, but not an extreme stratification. The range from simplest to most elaborate Dilmunite burial is significant, but not as vast as the range seen in, for example, the royal burials of Mesopotamia. Dilmun was a commercial civilization. Its elites were commercial elites, wealthy merchants, administrators, religious specialists, not warrior aristocrats, not god kings with the resources to entomb entire households of servants. The burial landscape reflects the character of the civilization that created it. The religious world of the Dilmunites is known to us primarily through two sources: the Sumerian texts that describe Dilmun in mythological terms, and the archaeological evidence of cult practice at Dilmunite sites. Together they suggest a religious tradition of considerable sophistication, one that was in dialogue with Mesopotamian religion while maintaining its own distinctive character. Inzak was the most important specifically Dilmunite deity. His name appears in Sumerian texts that identify him as the Lord of Dilmun, and in cuneiform inscriptions found at sites in the Gulf that record dedications and prayers addressed to him. His character, as far as we can reconstruct it, was that of a protective deity, the patron god of a specific place and its people, guardian of the island's sacred quality and its inhabitants' well-being. He was not a universal god of the Sumerian pantheon, not one of the great cosmic deities whose myths and cult were shared across the ancient Near East. He was Dilmun's god, specific to that place, embodying something essential about what Dilmun meant. The relationship between Inzak and the great Sumerian god Enki, who was, as we have seen, mythologically associated with the fresh water that defined Dilmun's sacred character, is complex. The texts sometimes seem to treat them as distinct figures, sometimes as aspects of each other. This may reflect the reality of religious contact between two cultures that were in sustained commercial exchange. As the Dilmunites encountered the Sumerian religious world through their trade contacts, as Sumerian merchants lived and worshipped in Dilmun, and Dilmunite merchants did the same in Mesopotamian cities, the religious traditions of both sides were brought into contact and began to influence each other. The temple at Barbar is the most extensively excavated religious site of the Dilmunite world. Located in the northern part of Bahrain, near the freshwater springs that were so central to the island's sacred identity, Barbar was an active religious site from approximately 2500 to 1800 BCE, a period of roughly 7 centuries of continuous cult activity. The temple was rebuilt at least 3 times during this period, each rebuilding on a larger and more elaborate scale than the previous one. The final form of the temple, the Barbar III phase, was a substantial structure raised on a platform above the surrounding landscape, approached by a monumental staircase with a central shrine room and surrounding colonnades. At the base of the temple, a freshwater spring, or rather a well that tapped the freshwater aquifer beneath the island, was incorporated into the sacred precinct. The spring was the physical manifestation of the divine gift of fresh water that made Dilmun holy. To worship at the Barbar temple was to worship in the presence of the miracle itself. Fresh water rising from the earth at the heart of a desert island surrounded by salt sea. Objects recovered from the Barbar temple include copper figurines, bronze vessels, pottery, and the remains of animal sacrifices. The range of materials suggests a cult that was well funded and regularly maintained, a temple that was central to the religious life of a significant community. The sacred landscape of Dilmun extended beyond the temples. The island itself was understood as a sacred place. The springs, the pearl beds, the date palms, the gentle rising of the land from the sea. All of this was the physical expression of divine blessing, the visible evidence that the gods had chosen this place and made it extraordinary. This understanding of the land itself as sacred, as a place where the boundary between the human and the divine was thin, where the Abzu could be felt rising through the earth, gives the Dilmunite religious world a quality that the more institutionalized religion of Mesopotamia, with its great professional temple complexes and its elaborate divine bureaucracy, sometimes lacks. Dilmun was holy because it was itself a wonder. The fresh water that rose from the sea floor was the proof. One of the most fascinating aspects of Dilmunite civilization is its relationship with the Indus Valley, the great urban culture that flourished, roughly contemporary with Dilmun's height, in the river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. The Indus Valley civilization, the culture of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, and the dozens of cities and towns that made it the largest urban culture of the Bronze Age world, remains one of the most puzzling civilizations of antiquity. Its script has never been deciphered. The language beneath it is unknown. The political and administrative structure that sustained its extraordinary urban development is not understood, and its connections to the wider world, the trade networks that brought goods in and sent goods out, are reconstructed primarily from the material evidence of those goods themselves. Among the most important evidence for Indus Valley external trade is its appearance at Gulf sites, including Dilmun. Indus Valley objects appear at Qal'at al-Bahrain and at other Dilmunite sites in quantities that reflect more than casual contact. The characteristic carnelian beads of the Harappan craftsmen, etched with white geometric patterns in a technique that required considerable technical skill, appear in Dilmunite contexts. Indus Valley pottery appears in Gulf sites. The square stamp seals of the Indus Valley, with their undeciphered pictographic inscriptions, appear at Sumerian sites in a way that suggests they passed through Dilmun on their way northward. The Sumerian texts name the distant eastern trading partner as Meluhha, a place that most scholars now identify with the Indus Valley, or at least with its coastal margins. The goods that Meluhha sent to Mesopotamia, the carnelian, the ivory, the cotton textiles, the gold, are the goods that the Indus Valley produced, and the route from Meluhha to Mesopotamia passed through Dilmun. The Dilmunites were, in the most precise sense, the intermediaries of this trade. The ships that brought Indus goods around the Arabian Peninsula or across the Arabian Sea to the Gulf stopped at Dilmun. The Dilmunite merchants processed the cargo, took their share, and forwarded the rest northward toward the Sumerian cities. This made Dilmun the junction between two of the greatest commercial civilizations of the Bronze Age world, Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. A position of extraordinary economic power, the more so because the alternative sea route, direct, bypassing Dilmun, was more difficult to navigate and less well served with the watering and provisioning facilities that the Dilmunite ports provided. The collapse of the Indus Valley civilization around 1900 BCE, its great cities abandoned, its trade networks dissolved, its people dispersing in ways that the archaeological record has not yet fully explained, must have had significant consequences for Dilmun. The eastern end of the Gulf trade network simply shut down. The ships from Meluhha stopped coming. The carnelian beads, the ivory, the cotton textiles, the exotic eastern goods that had flowed through Dilmunite harbors for centuries disappeared from the trade. The Dilmunite economy adapted. Trade with Mesopotamia continued. Trade with Oman continued. The pearl trade continued. But something was lost that could not be replaced: the eastern connection that had made Dilmun the junction of two great commercial worlds, rather than simply the entrepot of one. The second millennium BCE was a period of constant change in the ancient Near East, of rising and falling empires, of shifting trade routes, of civilizations that had seemed permanent discovering their vulnerability. Dilmun navigated this changing world with the pragmatism of a civilization that had always depended on commercial relationships rather than military power. The Kassite dynasty, which ruled Babylon from approximately 1600 to 1155 BCE, maintained commercial contact with Dilmun. Kassite administrative texts mention Dilmun, and the material culture of the Gulf in this period reflects continued connections with the Mesopotamian world. The Assyrian Empire, in its later period of expansion, extended its reach southward and eastward toward the Gulf, toward the trading civilizations that controlled the sea routes. The Assyrian king Sargon II, the same ruler who appears in the records of the Phrygian king Midas, who campaigned across the ancient Near East in the late 8th century BCE, records in his annals that he received tribute from Uperi, king of Dilmun, whose home is situated like a fish, 30 leagues away in the midst of the sea where the sun rises. This is a remarkable document. It confirms that Dilmun still existed as a political entity recognizable to the Assyrian imperial administration in the late 8th century BCE. It confirms that Dilmun's king was subject, at least nominally, to Assyrian authority by this period. And it preserves the poetic description of the island's location, 30 leagues in the sea, where the sun rises meets, that echoes the mythological language of the Sumerian texts. The Dilmunites were paying tribute to Assyria, but they were still there, still functioning, still identifiable as a distinct political and cultural entity. The Neo-Babylonian Empire that succeeded Assyria as the dominant power of the ancient Near East continued to have commercial contact with the Gulf region. The Persian Empire, which absorbed the Neo-Babylonian state in 539 BCE, integrated the Gulf into the enormous territorial system that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus. Under Persian rule, the Gulf trade continued, reorganized, redirected, incorporated into the Persian administrative and commercial framework. The distinctive character of Dilmunite civilization as a politically independent trading state with its own identity faded under the weight of imperial incorporation. The city of Qal'at al-Bahrain shows evidence of occupation during the Persian period, but occupation of a different character from the Dilmunite height. The great administrative and commercial systems that had made the city a major Gulf center were diminishing. The population may have been smaller. The range of trade goods was narrowing. The world was changing around Dilmun, and Dilmun was changing with it, becoming gradually less of what it had once been. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the 330s BCE, the Gulf entered a new phase of history. Alexander's campaigns took him as far as the mouth of the Indus. His generals and admirals explored the Gulf coastline. The texts that describe these explorations, preserved in later Greek and Roman sources, describe the Gulf Islands with the curious eyes of people encountering a known about but little understood part of the world for the first time directly. The island that had been Dilmun received a new name in the Greek sources, Tylos. The Greek writers who described it, Theophrastus, who mentioned its extraordinary cotton trees, Androsthenes, who accompanied Alexander's fleet and left an account of the Gulf, described an island of considerable fertility with large trees, fresh water, and evidence of the prosperity that the Dilmunite tradition had created. The name Dilmun faded from use in the historical record, replaced by Tylos in Greek and Latin sources. But the island continued to be inhabited, continued to be a commercial center of the Gulf, continued to exploit the natural advantages, the freshwater springs, the pearl beds, the strategic position, that had made it significant since the 3rd millennium BCE. The Hellenistic period in the Gulf was not a period of decline. It was a period of transformation. The commercial networks of the Gulf were integrated into the broader Hellenistic trading world, connecting more directly to the Mediterranean markets that Alexander's conquests had unified. Greek merchants appeared in Gulf ports. Greek coins circulated alongside local currency. The material culture of the Hellenistic world, the distinctive pottery, the bronze figurines, the glass, appeared at Gulf sites alongside the continuing local production. Dilmun, now Tylos, was participating in a new phase of the ancient world's commercial integration. But the specifically Dilmunite character of the civilization, the religious tradition centered on Inzak and the sacred springs, the distinctive seal-carving tradition, the administrative culture that had managed the Gulf trade for 2 millennia. This was dissolving into the broader Hellenistic world. The name changed, the character changed. What persisted was the location. The island in the Gulf, with its fresh water and its pearl beds and its strategic position, was too valuable to be abandoned. People continued to live there, to fish the pearl beds, to sail the Gulf waters. But the civilization that had built the burial mounds and the temple at Barbar and the city at Qal'at al-Bahrain, that civilization was becoming a memory. For most of modern history, the ancient civilization of the Gulf was either unknown or known only through the Sumerian texts that referenced Dilmun in mythological terms. The physical reality of Dilmunite civilization, the cities, the temples, the burial mounds, was present and visible to anyone who looked at the landscape of Bahrain. The burial mounds were impossible to miss. Qal'at al-Bahrain was an obvious tell, a mound of human occupation rising from the coastal plain. But without the archaeological context, without the framework that allows material remains to be read as history, the mounds were simply mounds. Mysterious, possibly ancient, but unconnected to the grand narrative of ancient civilization that European scholarship had constructed around Egypt and Mesopotamia and Greece. The Danish archaeological expedition to Bahrain, beginning in 1954, under the direction of Peter Glob and Geoffrey Bibby, changed everything. Bibby's popular account of the expeditions, Looking for Dilmun, published in 1969, brought the story of the ancient Gulf civilization to a general audience for the first time. The book combined the excitement of discovery with a clear-eyed understanding of what the discoveries meant, that in the Persian Gulf, a civilization of genuine antiquity and genuine significance had been largely overlooked by the world of ancient history scholarship. The Danish excavations established the basic chronological framework for Dilmunite civilization, identified the major site types and their periods of activity, and connected the archaeological material to the Sumerian textual references that identified the region as Dilmun. Subsequent work by Bahraini archaeologists, by French teams, by British and American scholars has built an increasingly detailed picture of the civilization the Danes first revealed. The ongoing excavations at Qal'at al-Bahrain have continued to refine the understanding of the site's long occupation history. New analysis techniques, radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis of organic remains, geophysical survey of unexcavated areas are adding detail to the picture that the original excavations could not provide. the excavation of unlooted burial mounds, carefully selected from the thousands that survive in varying states of preservation, has provided information about burial practice, social structure, and the biological lives of Dilmunite people that the monumental architecture alone cannot supply. Underwater archaeology in the waters around Bahrain has begun to investigate the submarine freshwater springs that were so central to Dilmun's identity, exploring the sea floor around the island for evidence of the ancient harbour facilities and the natural features that made the island sacred. The Bahrain National Museum in Manama presents the material culture of Dilmunite civilization to visitors from around the world. The stamp seals, the pottery, the burial goods, the architectural remains, giving physical form to a civilization that was, until recently, known primarily from the tablets of its trading partners. And the UNESCO World Heritage designation of Qal'at al-Bahrain, awarded in 2005, placed the ancient capital of Dilmun in the company of the world's most significant cultural heritage sites, acknowledging what the evidence demands, that this is not a peripheral footnote to the ancient world, but a central chapter in the story of how human civilization developed and connected. Dilmun is being recovered from the clay tablets of Sumer, where it was first described as paradise, from the burial mounds of Bahrain, where 100,000 dead bear witness to its sacred reputation, from the harbour layers at Qal'at al-Bahrain, where the commercial life of an ancient trading civilization can be traced in pottery and metalwork, and the residue of goods that pass through its docks. The freshwater springs of Bahrain are diminished now. Centuries of human use and more recently decades of industrial extraction from the aquifer that feeds them have reduced the flow that once made this island miraculous. The submarine springs that once bubbled up from the Gulf floor around the island's coasts, the springs that so astonished the ancient sailors who encountered them, are largely gone, their flow reduced to almost nothing by the pressures of a modern economy built on resources far more valuable than fresh water, but they have not entirely disappeared. In a few places in the early morning before the heat of the Gulf day has taken hold, you can still find water rising from unexpected places, still feel the coolness of it, still understand in a small way what the ancient Sumerians felt when they encountered this phenomenon. The sense of something beyond the ordinary, something that the world should not contain in this place, and yet does. Enki is still here, or something like Enki. Something ancient and cool and persistent, moving through the limestone beneath the island, rising toward the light. The burial mounds are still there. Tens of thousands of them, reduced from the original 100,000 by the construction of the modern city that has spread across the island, but still present, still visible in the landscape, the accumulated dead of a civilization that brought its beloved across the water to rest in paradise. The tell of Qal'at al-Bahrain is still there, still rising from the coastal plain, still holding within its layers the compressed history of 4,000 years of human occupation. The Portuguese fort at its summit, and beneath it the Dilmunite city, and beneath that the first settlers who came to this island in the 3rd millennium BCE and recognized immediately what it was worth. The pearl beds are still there, though the wild pearl industry that made Bahrain famous until the 1930s was effectively destroyed by the introduction of Japanese cultured pearls. The oysters still grow in the Gulf waters. The pearls still form slowly in their shells. They are simply no longer harvested the way they once were by the generations of divers who descended into the Gulf water to collect what the sea had made. Dilmun is gone. The civilization that built the temples and carved the seals and established the commercial network that connected Mesopotamia to the Indus. That civilization dissolved, as all civilizations dissolve, into the flow of time and the pressure of changing worlds. But the island remains. The same island where the god Enki caused fresh water to rise, the same island where the Sumerians found their paradise, the same island where 100,000 people were brought to rest in the holy ground, the same island where merchants from the oldest cities in the world came to trade and went away with pearls and copper and dates and the memory of a place that felt different from every other place they had ever been. The water is still rising. Not in the quantities it once did, not with the force that made it miraculous, but still there, still cool, still rising through the limestone from the aquifer that feeds it, the last whisper of the Abzu, the ancient freshwater deep that the Sumerians believed underlay the world. Rest now. The Gulf is still warm, the same Gulf the Dilmunite sailors crossed, carrying their pearls and their dates to the markets of the same water where the freshwater springs still rise, where paradise had its address in the world, where the lion did not kill, where the sick man did not say, "I am sick," where the old woman did not say, "I am old." Good night.